everyone, and welcome. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our discussion today on the foreign policy landscape facing the Biden administration. Well, it's quite a challenging landscape, to be sure. You know, after 4 years of the Trump administration of America First, of disdain for our traditional allies and alliances, of erratic engagements with Russia and China, North Korea and others, of withdrawal from the World Health Organization, the Paris Accords, and indeed a near abandonment of the traditional American leadership in international affairs. The Biden administration has certainly signaled an about face. Last week, President Biden's speech on foreign policy, the headline was "Diplomacy is back." The U.S. has rejoined the Paris Accord and the World Health Organization. The administration is being stocked with old hands and familiar faces. And really, the Biden administration really signaled that the U.S. is ready to resume its leadership role on the international stage. It's an almost dizzying back to the future moment. But can we go back? Will a wary world welcome and trust American leadership to the same degree that it once did? How might the dysfunction of our American democracy culminating in the globally broadcast spectacle of January 6th being replayed as we speak this week erode our standing in the world? And even if there's continued appetite for American leadership, much has changed in 4 years. I mean, we are farther than ever from the unipolar world. The Chinese juggernaut continues apace, and China's flexing its muscle on every front, from Belt and Road to saber rattling in the South China Sea. Across the globe, democracy has been on the decline, and nationalism and authoritarianism on the rise. And the agenda of issues that require leadership is certainly daunting, from issues around economic inequality, to climate change, to security, to managing the global pandemic, to human rights and more. It's a complex and formidable landscape, to be sure. But fortunately, to help us sort all of this out today, we have an extraordinary panel of experts. Let me introduce first our three panelists, and then my two colleagues who will moderate the discussion. Joining us today are Heather Hurlbut, who's Director of New Models for Policy Change at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Heather. Michael O'Hanlon, who's Director of Research and Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, also in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Fritz.
And Leslie Vinjamuri, who's Director of U.S. and the Americas Program and Dean of Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership in International Affairs at Chatham House in London. Welcome, Leslie. And to moderate today's discussion, two dear colleagues from the Korbel School, Professor Deborah Avant, who's Director of the Sié Chéou-Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy. Welcome, Debbie. And Professor Naazneen Barma, who's Director of the Scrivner Institute of Public Policy. Well, I can't wait for the discussion. It'll be absolutely fascinating. We have a wonderful panel, so I very much look forward to it. And I'll step back now and let me throw this to Deborah, Professor Avant, to carry on the discussion. Again, welcome everybody.
Great, thanks so much, Fritz. And we are so thrilled to have all of our guests here today. And just to give you a little sense of what the drill is going to be, we're going to ask a few rounds of questions and then it open up to audience questions. So if you guys have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring and we'll get to those in due course. But to start, I thought I would ask each of our panelists kind of the big question, like what are the biggest foreign policy challenges that you see for this administration? And are there any opportunities? We talk a lot about the challenges and the seriousness of the moment that we face, but does this also provide us with particular opportunities? And so I'll just go in alphabetical order. Start with Heather.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you so much to all of the Denver institutions that convened us for this conversation with some of my favorite people who I haven't gotten to see very much during the pandemic. So, I'm going to start with saying the annoying thing that insists on busting the parameters of the conversation, which is that the biggest foreign policy challenge right now is the apparent inability of US government institutions to meet the needs of the population and the degree to which that is visible to the rest of the world. So, I promise not to keep trying to sidetrack this conversation into talking about how we deal with our domestic policy challenges, but you have to stress over and over again how clear it is to the rest of the world that we're having enormous difficulty dealing with our domestic policy challenges and how that undermines both challenges and opportunities in other fields. And so you'll hear me come back over and over to the idea that unfortunately our oomph is less than we think it is for that reason. And that's a real danger. So I'll just put that out there as my sort of first overarching challenge. Second, climate change, which again, is a security issue and also not a security issue, and perhaps not most effectively combated as a security issue, but nonetheless, both on its own terms, a threat to the security of our people and also a security challenge multiplier in other parts of the world that we care about. And so then after those two, there's this great raging debate, at least in Washington and perhaps Leslie in London as well, that Mike and I both at least either partake in or watch from the sidelines with our popcorn. This debate of, is great power competition the right frame or the wrong frame? And, Anne-Marie Slaughter had this great comment the other day, which was, if you come at this through global issues, you will eventually come to great power competition. But if you start with great power competition, US diplomacy, the US security establishment tends to get sidetracked there and we never get to the other issues. So I've made a vow not to start with great power competition in these conversations, but that doesn't mean that we get to say, oh, only the global issues, only climate and pandemics matter, and the fact that other systems want to compete with us economically, want to compete with us on a security basis, and want to compete with us on a systems or ideological basis. That also, it matters, and you don't get to just wish one away by having the other. And I think that is plenty of introductory remarks from me.
Great, thank you. I think the domestic issue is something that we'll come back to again and again. So thank you for raising that. Michael.
Thank you, Debbie, and greetings, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And let me pick up where Heather left off and agree with her and just give a slightly different way to frame it, which I hope is complementary because I don't disagree with anything that she said. And I want to construct a two-dimensional axis, if you will, or spectrum of ideas, a two-dimensional system of threats. And about a half dozen years ago, the Pentagon used this construct of 4+1. Traditional national security threats of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, plus terrorism, which was, of course, more transnational. So that was one dimension. But then the second dimension of the axis or of the graph that I would propose, or of the matrix, if you will, builds on what Heather just said. And I'm proposing that we recognize the original 4+1 is still there. And I agree with Anne-Marie Slaughter, we'll get to it whether we like it or not. I might not want to prioritize one over the other. That's why I use two different separate dimensions, even though they overlap and wind up in the same broad foreign policy space. But if the traditional threats are on one axis, the other dimension that I would propose would be what you might call the new 4+1. And biological threats, with COVID-19 being the most obvious example, would have to be there. Climate threats would certainly be there. And I agree with Heather, they should be thought of as national security threats, regardless of how they're addressed, because they can affect large swaths of the population. They can also increase the risks of interstate war and of migration and refugee problems, and therefore they wind up in the national security basket, even if they don't start there. But anyway, biological threats, climate threats, digital threats, cyber, AI, and everything else under that broad rubric. Nuclear proliferation threats. And of course, the nuclear agenda also presents itself with the other 4+1 that I started with. But I think proliferation remains enough of a concern for other countries potentially as well, including, for example, in South Asia, that it's worth including. And then finally, the +1 is the internal threats that Heather alluded to. And the reason why that has to be seen as a national security threat, I think we all probably instinctively understand it is, but the reason why it has to be is that if we Americans wind up fighting amongst ourselves and electing politicians who don't believe in American global leadership, I fundamentally believe that that will be bad for the whole global order, not just for ourselves, but because the international order doesn't really do very well without a strong leader. And for all of our flaws as Americans, as a country, I don't see an alternative to American-led leadership, even with Fritz Mayer's very trenchant point at the beginning that our aggregate power relative to others is less. The Western alliance system really has not declined. I don't think it will decline. And I don't really believe there's an alternative leader to it. And therefore, I wind up thinking that the internal cohesion of our country and ability to operate as a polity on domestic and foreign policy issues should be viewed as itself a threat. So the old 4+1 of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and terrorism on one axis. The other axis, biological, climatic, nuclear, internal, and digital threats on the other axis. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Leslie.
Thank you for having me, first of all, Professor Avant and Professor Barma. It's really a pleasure and an honor, and to join my fellow panelists. I guess I would say I completely agree with what's been said, and I would add a few things. First of all, my view as an American, constantly sitting outside of America is certainly very much in line with those who precede me in thinking that finding a way to bring Americans together and address these deep divisions that are so tremendously on display is absolutely critical. And I would add two things to that. One is that the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world doesn't spend their time, as we know, talking about foreign policy, and they view America through the lens of the media. So I'm always surprised when I go home at how good things are, because they look so horrendously bad sitting here. Because if you watch CNN, if you watch the BBC, the drama is really the only thing that gets covered. The good news stories, the daily life that takes place just is completely and utterly invisible. And it's been invisible for the entire time. So I think the bar, not only the real story, which is repairing polarization and disinformation and everything that we know that's troubling in America, but it's sort of being able to demonstrate that, because I do believe, I really am of the mind that the power comes so much through the example. The second thing, though, that I would add to that is that, things aren't so great over here either. So, and I don't usually say that when I'm speaking to European audiences, but I do think that, it's fair to remind ourselves as people located in the US that, it's not great in the UK. I mean, talk about a mess for the last 4 years, as we know. It is getting a lot better as the story of, the tremendous ability to disseminate the vaccine, to deliver and distribute the vaccine is becoming the headline news. And as the Brexit thing is sort of over and one can begin to think about fixing it. But I think that, Americans and those located in America should sort of go, it's okay, the rest of the world isn't doing so well either. So therefore we are in it together. And so alongside the humility, I think there's an opportunity in rebuilding and reforging the alliance to say, we've all had a bad time and we all need to do this. And I think leadership could start at some point, I don't know whether it's 60 days or 90 days, I think leadership could begin to say that as a way of bringing other publics on board. And I know that's part of the idea potentially of a summit of democracies. And then the other things I would say kind of line up with that. And so seeing the US lead on the values conversation and implementing that through recognizing that, the pandemic is not just a national problem in the US, but the US needs to get out and lead. And I think that's been one of the gravest disappointments in Europe and certainly in the UK is, the debacle, the tragedy of denying the pandemic and then not taking a leadership role. So I think that is a huge opportunity, and it's a very short-term, immediate opportunity that could deliver back in spades. And then alongside that, I think cracking the cooperating with Europe and with the UK on questions of technology, values, and getting into the questions of social media regulation, disinformation, et cetera, right? Because that's a very big bucket. But I think that those are like really, really immediate things that speak to the values question, speak to the democracy question, where without the US leading, and I agree very much with Michael and Helen that there's not a good alternative to US leadership. But without the US leading, especially in those very immediate issues, that there's very little hope, I think, sadly. The UK, has great expertise, but cannot do it on its own. So I think the US getting out in front would be really great.
That's great. So as moderators, Naz and I were chatting and decided we couldn't really be quiet. So we're going to ask each other questions too. So I'll throw this question to Naz first.
Thanks, Debbie. And thanks so much, Leslie, Michael, and Heather for joining us. This is really a dream conversation to have. As Debbie said, we couldn't resist chiming in ourselves. And I'll just build on, what the three of you have already said. I mean, and refer back to what Fritz Dean Mayer kicked us off with, which was President Biden's first major foreign policy speech of his presidency at the State Department a few days ago, where he promised international re-engagement. And I think that, his instincts and those of his top foreign policy team are certainly dominated by a commitment to the multilateral liberalism grounded in international institutions that you're all talking about. And that recommitment to American cooperation globally is certainly going to be welcome for our friends and allies. And certainly, I think that they're going to be breathing a sigh of relief, if not already, at what will undoubtedly be a less erratic and personalized foreign policy agenda. But I guess I worry that this is going to come with a set of heightened expectations for the prospects of multilateral cooperation. And so to me, the other side of the coin is that those multilateral instincts are also going to prove a real challenge for the Biden administration, right? The fact of the matter is that, the kinds of institutions that we're talking about have had a great deal of difficulty in making global progress on collective action problems like the climate crisis for a very long time. And it's not, American recommitment to those institutions is not a silver bullet. And I think we all recognize that. And so I worry that the Biden team will get a little bit bogged down in attempts to repair and reform those international institutions for the modern age without having then any real progress to show on the outcomes that are going to matter. And here I would point to Michael's, 4+1, dramatic action on the climate, reversing the populist authoritarian tide around the world, combating nuclear proliferation and disinformation and so on. And so I think, relatedly, I kind of, add this on top, in addition to the domestic issues that all of you have pointed to kind of so, I think correctly, I share the view that, repair at home is necessary for repair abroad. But I think there's also, Biden has inherited the 21st century challenge of recalibrating America's role in the world and in a sort of, shifting geopolitical landscape. And so sort of overlaid on top of that challenge is, humility for what we can achieve given that shifting landscape, along with the confidence, that I think Secretary Blinken expressed so admirably in his Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, that humility and confidence are the two sides of the U.S. Approach to the world. So I'm not immune to hope either, that it will be possible. And that, I think collectively, Biden himself and his team have the sort of shared temperament, experience, and vision to make headway on both domestic and international fronts. And I'm looking forward to having more of a conversation about that with all of you. Debbie, I'm going to throw the question back to you.
Great, thanks. Well, it's fun to go at the end because you guys have touched on so many of the things that I wanted to talk about, because I do think I think the domestic politics issue is key here. But I'm going to frame it in a little bit different way, because I think we can think about domestic politics as creating sort of constraints on American policy. You can also think about sort of domestic politics and foreign policy as somewhat in tension with one another. Just this weekend, I was reading about, Biden's relaxation of immigration is creating this, surge of immigrants. And given the COVID situation, that's going to be complicated. So I don't want to diminish either of those. But there are ways in which how the US engages in foreign policy can actually play in a positive way in the domestic sphere. And I think this is actually critically important because, as Leslie said, it's not only the US that is dealing with these issues of polarization, challenges to the democratic order, et cetera. And so I've been thinking a lot about the way in which there are ways that we manage the sort of new threats that Michael laid out that have been productive in generating a certain set of relationships that sometimes leads the US even to change its mind on how things go, where the US doesn't look like a bullying leader, but perhaps like a more gracious, humble leader. And if you look back in time, a lot of the key moments of leadership in the US have been moments in which it has been able to have that sort of humble place on the global scene in a way that has also played into strength domestically. And I think if you look at the collaboration over a variety of new issues, certainly over my career, a lot of them actually have not been in the kind of highline multilateral organizations. They've been in these much more incidental multi-stakeholder initiatives and other kinds of things that have arisen around particular kinds of problems. And what's interesting is that so far, the US hasn't been able to really sell these as an effective leadership forum. But just this morning, I was reading a War on the Rocks piece by Jeremy Shapiro about Biden's particular self-deprecating humor and the way it might spell a much more kind of humble American leadership. And I thought there are some interesting possibilities in which, coming on the heels of Trump at this particular moment when we're facing so many challenges, that this particular person with a set of relationships that actually Heather has written about really interestingly, might be able to frame these different kinds of initiatives in a way that could actually garner some political purchase abroad and also at home in ways that might be able to at least begin to mend some of these fairly desperate concerns that we have domestically. So with that, let me turn it back to you, Naz, to ask some follow-up questions.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask our panelists a round of questions here, but I also would like to remind our audience to please submit via chat any questions that you may have, since we'll be picking up on those after this round. It may look like your question is only going to the Scrivner Institute of Public Policy account, but we are, please rest assured that we're collecting those, and we have a method of making sure that your questions are being seen. So please do ask away, and we'll look forward to receiving those questions. Heather, I'm going to start with you, and I'm kind of come back and invite you to say more about the domestic policy side of things with it, which I think you so rightly kind of opened with. And in particular, I mean, certainly to respond to some of the points that Debbie just made at the end there, but to ask you, what does a foreign policy for the middle class really mean? And is there a match between, or a mismatch between, our foreign policy ambitions on the one hand and our domestic capacities to be able to achieve those ambitions?
Well, thanks. This is going to let me pick up on several things that that each of you said, really, because I think the way that and foreign policy for the middle class is Jake Sullivan's phrase, the national security advisor. And the way, I think, not to speak for Jake, but the way the genesis of it really comes out of some of the difficulties that the Obama-Biden administration had in its last years, and that then Hillary Clinton had in the 2016 campaign, with a variety of initiatives, but really most of the public ire got focused around the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The idea being that initiatives that for decades had been assumed by national security policy elites like all of us here to be self-evidently in the American interest were perceived by large swaths of the public as very much not in their economic security, and maybe for some on the right, what I will euphemistically refer to as cultural security. So therefore, Jake, and I think there's a school of other writers and thinkers who've kind of popped up circling these themes in the last 4 years of saying that since we no longer have the existential threat of the Cold War connecting to people's sense of self-interest, American foreign policy has to be reconstrued in ways that more directly connects to people's sense of self-interest. And in a time where sort of those self-interests also include a pervasive sense of economic stagnation and inequality, a sense of democratic and institutional decay, and a sense of sort of loss of prestige and standing in the world. So that actually plays right into some of the dilemmas that each of you were talking about, because where all of us who came into foreign policy, during the Cold War or at the end of the Cold War, you sort of had a much larger reservoir of benefit of the doubt to play with, that when you said we're going to do X overseas because it's good for us at home. And I think one way that you can portray the Cold War, the post-Cold War period, is that benefit of doubt was eaten away and eaten away and eaten away. And we can have really fun conversations about why and how, but nonetheless, regardless of one's ideology on the matter, here we are. And that, frankly, puts you directly at odds with this idea of renovating multilateral leadership. Because, and I say this as someone who was a speechwriter for many years, it is so damn hard to explain to the American public how you are getting anything out of, people love the idea of multilateralism, but the minute you get into the specifics of it, and I got to say, for good reason, I always say as a liberal, nothing makes me more sympathetic to conservatives than dealing with lots of multilateral bodies. So that, at sort of a very high level is what the idea is, but specifically, right? And I want to go back to something that Leslie said, because I profoundly agree with her that the future of US alliances and of the alliance system is going to be less in the hard military cooperation that we think of them being, and much more in a kind of economic and tech security space. How do we deal with cyber? How do we deal with both the security and identity rights of the citizen? How do we protect people's economic security and sense of place? But to do that, we also have to do that in ways that are reassuring and immediately beneficial to American workers, American taxpayers. And it turns out that some of our biggest opponents in that space, in addition to China, are our allies. And the economic and tech side of the alliance looks really different. And I profoundly believe that it's possible to get to a place where our security allies and we are also building democratic marketplaces. But I think the difficulty and frankly, the unsuitedness of existing multilateral institutions has been grossly underestimated by lots of us who want to talk positively about the alliances, but are sort of not used to just how hard it's going to be.
Thank you, Heather, and sort of a perfect segue into what I was going to ask Michael about. And so still, well, Michael, you've written so much and so extensively about traditional security threats, like the war in Afghanistan, North Korea, Russia, China, and so on, the kind of traditional great power and kind of strategic concerns. I'd love to just invite you to say a little bit more about how you think your two axes, the 2 4+1s, are sort of going to, if there are ways in which some of the objectives from the U.S. perspective are complementary with the great power competition frame, or whether there are ways in which those two axes that sort of run at cross purposes to each other and are going to kind of bring new tensions in our foreign policy that we haven't really seen before.
Thanks, Naz. Let me take 2 examples, and I don't think that they have to be at cross purposes. There are times where they're distinct, other times where they overlap, intersect, exacerbate, or potentially help each other. Let me start with North Korea and then also go to Russia and NATO and just say a brief word on each of those 2 questions. And on North Korea, I believe the Biden administration is going to have to think hard. This is, in fact, where President Obama told then President-elect Trump in their White House meeting of November 2016, just after the election, that Obama recognized his policy had failed. And I think Trump's has also failed. But Trump's was disruptive in a way that it would be a shame to discard altogether just because I don't like Donald Trump and just because I don't really think that he was a good leader for American foreign policy. There was something about face-to-face diplomacy, or at least let's say high-level diplomacy, that had certain advantages. And for Democrats who want to fry me right now, let me remind them that it was Barack Obama in his first inaugural who said, we will reach out our hand to anyone who would unclench their fist. Obama wanted to talk to rogue state leaders. Trump actually succeeded. The problem with Trump's agenda is he didn't take it anywhere, and he didn't wind up in a better place with the partial exception, relatively modest, although not trivial, that at least North Korea is not testing nuclear weapons or ICBMs at the moment, and at least there is no imminent sense that we're about to fight them. Those are actually important things, but it's not a stable path, and it certainly isn't a resolution of the growing North Korean nuclear arsenal problem. So I think what the Biden administration should do is think hard about the fundamental question, can we really go for broke and insist on complete North Korean denuclearization in the first instance as part of the first deal we try to negotiate? In which case I would predict their chances for success are in the single-digit percentages at most. Or should they be more realistic? And I think the way to be more realistic is to propose, along with other countries, a partial lifting of sanctions in exchange for a dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear production capability. But for the moment, we don't worry about the bombs they already have. Doesn't mean we condone their possession of those bombs, but we don't try to disarm them in the first instance. To me, that's the realistic goal. And that's the way you handle the nuclear proliferation worry, which is one of my new 4+1, with the North Korea problem, which is one of the old 4+1. But in fact, on that issue, the two come together. Very quickly on Russia. And again, we've heard a lot of people today already speak about recognizing the new multipolarity or the new distribution of power on the global stage. I think the way in which we chose to expand NATO after the Cold War, at a minimum, was done carelessly, and perhaps was even simply a mistake. But in any event, has run its course. And it hasn't just run its course because, Russia doesn't like it. It's also because the idea of committing American military personnel to defend countries that are in and around the Black Sea region and not at the heart of geopolitics or global economic or military capability. They would not fall within any kind of George Kennan-like, perimeter of where our top security interests lie. And we just can't afford to pretend that the United States can physically and militarily protect everybody all over the world. And in the case of Georgia and Ukraine, whoever might be morally right, and I don't think it's Vladimir Putin, that trying to expand NATO, which is still our official policy, to those former Soviet republics is guaranteed to anger Russia even more and to produce a counter-reaction. So if you know that, I don't think you sit on your moral high horse and say, just because we are somehow, in the noble position of advancing democracy and giving other countries their choice about their alliance structures, that therefore we do what is bound to be counterproductive. So I want to see a new discussion about a new security architecture for Central and Eastern Europe that requires Russia to keep its mitts off countries that are sovereign, but also is willing to entertain the possibility that we will not try to bring them into NATO now or ever. And we will look for some alternative way to think about their security. So that's dealing with one of the old 4+1 threats of Russia, but trying to recognize the changing realities of this new world. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And I'm going to ask Leslie to sort of wade in then on perhaps some of the moral questions and the sort of the values-based element of what the Biden administration might be able to achieve vis-a-vis countries, like Russia, Myanmar, more recently, People's Republic of China's actions in Xinjiang with the Uyghur population and so on and so forth. In terms of our values, what should we be foregrounding? What could we achieve? Our mutual friends, I think our collective mutual friends, Jim Goldgeier and Bruce Gentleson, have written in the pages of Foreign Affairs that we need a democracy summit at home before we can do anything on democracy abroad. Would you agree with that? Or do you think that we do have an ability to promote a values agenda? And how do you see that playing out?
Well, it's clearly very difficult. And already we've seen quite a lot of movement at the level of words and calling abuses of democracy, the assault on democracy in Russia, the coup in Myanmar, any number of cases, Saudi Arabia, and far beyond, being the subject of tweets and other policy statements. And I think that there is, I guess the first thing I would say is making it very clear rhetorically, and being very consistent what the US stands for when it comes to questions of human rights and democracy is a very good idea. And I think I would weigh that in terms of the alternative, which is doing nothing and saying nothing, which I think is actually a very bad idea. So, for the baseline, sort of upping the ante of the baseline, not only to put it out there, but also to differentiate the current administration from the last 4 years is incredibly important. And I don't think that you have to be perfect at home in order to recognize the importance of those values in your foreign policy. In fact, going back to my first comment, I think, in fact, it will be key for the US to demonstrate, as it's pushing that agenda abroad, that it's also committing to things like accountability and looking at questions of racial justice, which are clearly front and center, questions of inequality, and questions of insurrection or a coup, whatever it is that we think took place on January 6th, in a very serious and rigorous way, will be the necessary factor for shoring up the articulation of those values in US foreign policy. Secondly, I think it needs to be done, in partnership, ideally with America's allies and with America's partners wherever possible. But I think that, it is clearly going to be incredibly difficult to have any real impact on questions of the Uyghurs, on questions of the coup in Myanmar, on questions of Russia and the opposition and peaceful protesters being locked in jail. And I would caution against the use of hard instruments of power at this stage. So I think there's a real where do you draw the line, and what is your sequencing? The other thing I would say, and it comes back to something that Professor Avant said, and it's the Jeremy Shapiro piece about, is humility and kind of the soft joke, the recognition of one's own flaws, that sort of, Biden manifest, is that enough? Is that going to really turn the needle? And I guess I would say that I'm very, I think it's a wonderful thing, but I'm very skeptical that in terms of America's foreign engagement, it's going to do much, because people are already, certainly in Europe, they're already completely sold on Biden. There's no problem with Biden. They feel like they know what it is and they love it and they're reassured. They have some questions about how long it will last, and that's a very significant thing. So the credibility question, I think, is a big one. But I think that the real question, and I'm not saying that it's more important out beyond America's borders, but it's certainly magnified and discussed all the time in ways that I personally often feel very uncomfortable with as an American living abroad, is the question of Trumpism living on past Donald Trump. Now, that's a big conversation in the US. I think the way that it's sort of framed over here is that it's there, it's never going away, it's terrible, there will be more violence, Trump is the party. There is just a sweeping assumption. There's not a lot of rigor in that debate. And, if it is a more nuanced question, I think it needs to be reflected for the rest of the world to try and understand, because right now I think that they just simply don't believe that a Biden can turn the needle on democracy, on human rights, on values, with that internal threat at home.
Debbie, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask some more questions. But before I do, I'd like to ask you one more question, if I may. Michael talked about the sort of the geopolitical. Heather talked about the sometime mismatch between our geopolitical objectives and our domestic economic and technological concerns. Leslie, I think, just really sharpened some of the tensions on the values side of things. You've written a lot about pragmatic foreign policy, and I wonder if you have a view on, sort of from a pragmatist perspective, what are the one or two things that the U.S. might be able to achieve that sort of starts to put some pillars in place and build goodwill of the type that we're all talking about? So it's an easy question.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think finding things that work in the short term is incredibly important. So I do think this idea of sort of, going for the low hanging fruit. And I mean, some of the low hanging fruit right now, I think, is humility, is sort of, and maybe a certain sharing of humility, like recognizing, yes, we just had an insurrection on January 6th, and look at what is happening among the politics of all of our friends. Sort of joining forces in some senses. I also wonder, for so long, when we're sort of thinking about foreign policy for the middle class, the idea of protection for people economically in the US and trade abroad have been seen as, at juggernauts, really. And yet, to the degree that almost all of our friends are facing the same kind of inequality concerns, it strikes me that there is a possibility for some kind of conversation in that way. And then, of course, the pandemic. I think the pandemic and sort of, it's at the front and center of all of our minds. Anything that this administration can do to really show collaboration that works abroad, but also at home. I think, those are the three things that pop immediately to mind. But I do believe that, one of the things about pragmatism, which makes it sort of nice as a foreign policy tool and annoying to analyze as an analyst, is that it is paying attention to the dance, paying attention to, the process that you're going through and knowing that there are timing issues and other kinds of things going on. And so I think that it's not something that provides a really clear roadmap forward outside of, sort of looking outside of the sort of tried and true paths sometimes to those things that are kind of on the fringes that might offer some interesting possibilities forward. So thank you, Naz, for that. I'll come back to you in a bit, but I actually want to ask first a question from Doug Scrivner. Doug, I'm so happy that you're here. And he asks a question that sort of builds on this, I think, a little bit. And he says, perhaps rejoining the WHO as an example, how does the US exercise its role to address the effectiveness of institutions, but also corruption and possibly malign influence on those institutions, talking particularly of the role of China at the beginning of the pandemic, probably. But I don't know if any of you want to sort of take that question. How is it that the administration might balance rejoining and dealing with potentially malign influences on these institutions? Yeah, Mike.
First of all, greetings to Doug, and I'm not sure this is a great direct answer. I'm going to tackle a piece of the corruption problem, and it may not be the one that you're most focused on with WHO, although I think that the Chinese have tried to weaken certain organizations without necessarily always corrupting them in the sense of misdirecting their resources. So I'm not yet persuaded that corruption in that sense of sort of financial impropriety is a huge concern at WHO. But where it has been a concern is in some of our Middle Eastern policy. And here I want to celebrate the facts that we're in a much different place in Iraq and Afghanistan than we were 10, 15 years ago. A lot of people are just frustrated we're still there at all. And I certainly share that frustration. I certainly think our men and women in uniform and the Foreign Service and AID have a right to be frustrated even more than the rest of us. But I also think we may have struggled our way towards a policy that minimizes the worst downsides of engagement. And partly because it is so modest in both countries now, in the broad range of 2,500 to 3,000 US troops and aid programs that are scaled back, in particular in regard to Iraq, that I think the corruption dilemma has been partly downsized as well. It's still there. And we need to be very careful about it as we invest in those two countries going forward. I would favor some of the ideas that Sarah Chase and others have put forth for being more conditional in which government agencies, for example, in Afghanistan, we are willing to provide money to. And rather than, always ask for new policies on corruption, condition next year's money based on last year's performance and just be a little more pragmatic, case by case, agency by agency in some of those countries. So those would be a couple of ideas on the broad corruption problem with a particular focus on Iraq and Afghanistan.
And Heather, Leslie, do you have anything to add?
I would
on
add
that?
one
Yeah.
thing. I mean, maybe I'm dreaming, but I think I woke up this morning to a story that China had asked the WHO to investigate the US as being the source of the COVID pandemic. I must have dreamt that because I was so I think there is a serious problem. And I guess, it comes down to your view of, do you quit or do you stay in the game and try to reform from within? And I would certainly argue that the cost of quitting, the sort of, the perception and the way that people saw America in terms of being a leader and being engaged at a time of deep, deep global crisis was just simply too high. And it makes a lot more sense to stay in, to take baby steps, to form your partnerships with others who also don't like the games that are being played, to call them out, to work the system, and then also to invest in other organizations that are working in the same space, but perhaps more flexibly and more efficiently, transnationally, but stay in the game and move the needle, because what we know the story, right? If you vacate the space, it doesn't remain vacant. Somebody else steps in. Often it's China with a different set of priorities and norms and way of doing business. So, but I think it is important. It would not be a good idea not to recognize it, although it does seem like it's being well recognized.
Let me just, Heather, I want to hear what you have to say about this, but if I can just bring in two other questions from the chat, which sort of speak directly to this. There's kind of two perspectives on China and from the questions. One from Pankaj, and thank you for the comment that, generally he's sort of characterizing China's approach in the context of COVID-19 pandemic as unethical, and that has led to the world suffering a great deal as a result of its unethical behavior. Whereas Rafael Lloris, who's one of our colleagues here at DU, has pointed to how, as a result of China's better handling of the pandemic, it has got, sort of taken on growing influence in many parts of the developing world. And so I wonder, what you think is, in a way, is there a right narrative? Is there a correct narrative there? Or how does it kind of play into what Leslie was just talking about?
I actually want to go back to a comment Leslie made about how odd it is to be abroad and see the United States described in ways that reflect part of the reality, but not the whole reality. And having said that, you would think that as Americans, we could also get used to the idea that the world's other largest societies are too complex to be contained in one narrative, but we're really bad at that. But in all seriousness on this question and on the whole range of things we're discussing, the more we can avoid trying to force Beijing or any other power into a single narrative, the fewer policy mistakes we're going to make. So my first answer is to refuse to answer your question, which is not very nice. But it does raise, I think, an opportunity to sort of foot stamp a couple of the things that were said earlier. I mean, it is the case that Beijing did some things that were egregiously wrong, and then it did some other things that are frankly much better than we have handled them here. And so a sophisticated policy run by sophisticated adults, such as the ones that are in charge now, but also such as all of us discussing it, needs to be able to take advantage of those things. And, frankly, one of the reasons multilateralism is so hard is that the narratives we used to talk about it at home are very simplistic and black and white, and the realities of it are very gray. So I think Leslie's point about engaging in institutions, but also thinking about alternatives and flexible alternatives to institutions is a very, very important one. And it gets us into a lot of trouble with allies and partners, some of whom are much more attached to the traditional institutions than we are. So again, sort of the goal of effective policy and the goal of hugging the allies close sometimes come into conflict. The other thing I wanted to quickly say on the anti-corruption agenda is that I really like Abigail Bellows' work at Carnegie, where she's put together a nice agenda. And one of the things that she talks about is mainstreaming, so that we don't think of corruption as a different stream of work, but something that we think about as a factor when we're thinking about, and I think, Michael, this sort of goes to your points about Iran and Afghanistan, and frankly, anywhere else that the US is engaged, that you build in thinking about, and frankly, that we get away from the assumption that we're only going to encounter corruption in places like Iran and Afghanistan and not places like Brussels, Geneva, et cetera, but that you're just thinking both about non-great power corruption, but also where our great powers, the phrase Abigail uses is weaponizing, but there's a lot of weaponizing going on in IR theory these days. But where corruption is being used for either state or non-state ends.
Great. Okay, we have a gap. Shall I go now?
Yeah, I think that, sorry, that's what I was waiting for.
We're trading off back and forth. Yeah, so there are a couple of people that are asking about some sort of specific human rights concerns, either in terms of action in certain camps in China, reaction to Navalny's arrest. So if the US is being the sophisticated actor that's able to hold multiple narratives in place and presumably to try to exploit those in a way to sort of push things in a more positive direction, how do you deal with some of these really concrete examples of human rights abuses, both in Russia or China or other places of your concern? There's actually a fair amount of concern in the Q&A on the Middle East as well.
Shall I try?
Yeah, go.
It's really hard. I mean, it's a thing that I find myself completely stuck on China. So, I guess one step is it's good that when the EU negotiated its investment treaty with China, which, obviously the Biden administration was not happy about, it's good that the French stood up and said, we're not going to agree this text unless you talk about labor rights. So that's one step. It's not great that it was, sort of very watered down, and it's not even clear whether that investment treaty will get passed. But I think that having the language there, and it's language that I think is accepted in the U.S. context of that's being worked out in the context of the current administration, the new administration. Having the language there as a sign, and perhaps going so far as to say we're not going to accept goods that rely on forced labor. That's sort of the one big question. That of course the rubber hits the road if or when China says, okay, fine, you do that. We're not going to talk to you about climate. We're not going to talk to you about trade. We're not going to talk to you about North Korea. To go to Michael O'Hanlon's area. Then I think that's the part where I'm totally stuck, because I don't know yet, and I'm not sure who does, because I haven't listened to a lot of people debate this. We all recognize it's the big problem. When they draw the line, and when they draw the line, what does the US and Europe, what is the response? And I think that is going to be the very big challenge. I don't see that we have effective levers apart from calling it out and putting it in putting the language there, playing the long game. And we didn't have effective levers during the Cold War, and we played the long game. We had the Helsinki process. Right. We kept the space alive. We knew we weren't going to end the Cold War by human rights naming and shaming. But I think it mattered that it was there, right? As a separate track. And I think that is probably the holding space right now.
Leslie, I think that is so important, and this might just be showing my age and that I started out my life working at the Helsinki Commission, but I do think when human rights came to the fore as a concept debated both in US foreign policy and as something that civil society globally organized around, there was not the expectation that anything would change overnight. And it was this much more sort of the slow boring of hard boards, and that what you were doing as a government was providing support and solidarity, not that you could magically change anybody's situation. And I think we're gonna, in an era where the human rights violations we're complaining about are coming from very powerful states, or even to the point of the questioners coming from not so powerful states that we can't or won't do anything about. We need to, it's less that we should stop being concerned about human rights, but we really need to redefine, be a little more modest, to go back to this is a place I share the skepticism about the humility language, but this is a place where modesty and humility are really needed. You pursue human rights because they're important and because the idea of them is something that binds civil societies together, not because tomorrow we can unfortunately shut down camps, Uyghur camps or anything.
Yeah. Well, and it strikes me actually, another thing that Leslie said that I thought was important is that the US government is not the only lever. There are many other ways in which you can approach these things. And having, one of the things I think that the US has done pretty effectively in kind of the functional part of the State Department, at least, is really create relationships with a variety of different kinds of initiatives that can sort of step in when the US can't necessarily put its thumb on things. And so I just, I think that which tools, I mean, I guess I will punt this back to Michael a little bit, is which tools do you use for which concerns? I really like your depiction of these different axes, and I'm just wondering what you think about the foreign policy tools that might be useful for meeting the demands of different parts of that graph.
Yeah, Debbie, thanks. I think, for example, that the sanctions that are now in place against Russia are primarily about its behavior in Ukraine, to some extent Syria, and also in our own democracies. And they are, with the Magnitsky Act, they do concern Russian internal behavior and treatment of its own people as well, but there are somewhat separate sanctions. Now, because we've been so comprehensively and justifiably angry with Putin for the last 7 years, there hasn't been a lot of discussion about separating and parsing one type from another. But I think we may have to get to that. And we also need to keep the level of rhetoric at the right level of intensity. We have to be offended when terrible things happen. But, again, picking up on some of the themes that Heather and Leslie and you have mentioned, we also need to avoid arrogance. We need to recognize how many things we get wrong in this country. We need to be willing to listen to other countries chew us out once in a while, and just sort of get used to that level of dialogue and not be afraid of it, but also not elevate it excessively. So I guess I would say some sanctions about Navalny or Magnitsky or whomever are fine, but I wouldn't make it impossible to lift other sanctions on Russia based on the internal human rights issue alone. And with China, maybe I'll use that example, on the rhetorical side, when you're going to criticize China for what it's been doing in Hong Kong or Xinjiang, for example, I just think once in a while we should more frequently, from the perspective of the US government, compliment China on the most amazing anti-poverty accomplishment in the history of humanity, for which, by the way, we helped by creating an international economic order and inviting them in. And so we should be willing to give ourselves a small pat on the back too. But I think when you put human rights in that kind of a broader context, you're less likely to offend people. And we are dealing with people who, my old colleague Jung Pak used to say, Kim Jong-un is a dictator, but he's a person too. She wasn't trying to suggest excessive kindness towards him, but she was just remarking that, he'll react sometimes emotionally, and all leaders do. So if you're trying to have a constructive dialogue, sometimes you put these things into perspective. There isn't much perspective with North Korea, but with China, I think their human rights record, if you define human rights broadly to include economic rights, is a much more mixed bag than we sometimes allow ourselves to acknowledge in the West.
I think if I could just add one thing to that, I think the sort of the flip side of that coin is sort of who is the audience to whom we are pitching our rhetoric, right? There's a way in which you are talking to elites in the ways that you're suggesting, Michael, could be more productive. But the U.S. is also talking to the domestic populations, of all the countries that we're talking about here. And I actually grew up in Hong Kong, and so the fact of the one thing I think the Trump administration sort of surprisingly sort of there were strange bedfellows between the Trump administration and the democracy movement in Hong Kong, because they were effectively speaking to the democracy youth themselves, and so there was an interesting tension there. Leslie, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I actually wanted to get Michael's perspective on the human rights question in North Korea, which got so much attention in 2014 when the Commission of Inquiry released its report, when talks weren't really happening. So I found that a lot of people who were that I talked to who were on the nuclear negotiation side were suddenly willing to raise the human rights issue and kind of get on board. And now from where I sit, I feel like I never hear about human rights abuses and atrocities in North Korea anymore. It's gone either they've totally changed to become completely clean, or we're just not interested anymore. And so I'm curious, what your view would be on pushing the human rights issue or sequencing it with the nuclear talks if there is a restart of nuclear talks.
Well, this is where I thought that, President Trump created opportunities. He just squandered them on North Korea. I was not against the high level diplomacy. It was probably a little too high. I didn't mind them meeting once. Once was probably enough, unless you had something to actually agree to and implement. But high level dialogue is useful. And I would suggest that President Biden send over a Jake Sullivan or someone who's maybe a notch below Tony Blinken in stature in the government, but still who can speak for the president. And I think with Kim Jong-un, the basic way I would think about it is to say to him, listen, there are probably 3 different ways that we can think about our economic relations. And 2 of them concern sanctions, and 1 concerns cooperation and assistance and investment and opening. And some of the sanctions we will lift if you do a partial nuclear deal. And we can do that with the UN Security Council. Some of the sanctions that were imposed, for example, in 2017, after the big nuclear test and the ICBM tests. Then there are sanctions that are American sanctions, which are intended to deal with everything else. And also, by the way, some of these sanctions could be used to try to get to a denuclearization in a second deal, a complete denuclearization. And then there's the whole positive agenda. The positive agenda can't happen until you reform your human rights. We can't condone your gulag system. We can't, watch over an economy in which the vast preponderance of Koreans live horrible lives. So we can't really be your friends until that agenda advances. But we are prepared to look at other elements, especially on the sanctions side, and change those as you make progress on the military and strategic and nuclear front. So I would like to lay out that whole conversation with somebody who's high enough that Kim Jong-un knows that person's speaking for President Biden, and try to do it fairly matter-of-factly and do it repeatedly. And then you can, once you sort of sketch out your longer-term vision, then you can begin to tackle specific pieces. But you never lose sight of the longer-term vision, and therefore you never lose sight of the human rights issue either.
Heather, we've got a couple of questions here that are kind of on the question of economic globalization and sort of Trump, the Biden administration's domestic economic policy agenda and how it relates to the role that the U.S. is going to play economically abroad. And so I guess I would ask you kind of a little bit of a reprise of the question I asked you at the beginning. What does the Build Back Better agenda at home and our commitment to full employment, infrastructure investments, and so on and so forth, what does that mean for the U.S.'s commitment to free trade, open kind of economic globalization abroad? And is China, in a way, also to bring China back in again, kind of in some ways sort of superseding the U.S.'s leadership on some of these economic globalization dimensions via the Belt and Road Initiative?
So I want to try to separate the Belt and Road conversation from a kind of free trade conversation. So Belt and Road, there's just no question that Beijing has put an enormous amount of money into that, which has not been matched by the US. And that, of course, the US has been trending down over the years in how, at a government level, we are involved in supporting economic development in less developed parts of the world. So there's just, Beijing is doing that. Now you can I think it's very both important to take it really seriously as a geopolitical tool, and at the same time to say it has its limits as a geoeconomic strategy, right? It is very unclear that Beijing is actually building kind of a real market, a real economic system, the way we think of an economic system, the way the US built one with the Western world during the Cold War, or the kind of system that we were aspiring to build through the WTO after the Cold War. So the Belt and Road is a real problem, which the US can't be tempted into trying to compete on a dollar for dollar basis, because our system just isn't going to produce those kinds of dollars. And this actually goes right back to the corruption conversation, because the beauty of being an autocracy is you can just put your money where you want to put your money, and it doesn't matter what happens to it after that so much. Although even Beijing there are limits internally, and the people who study that have very interesting things to say. So BRI is a big, big problem for US geopolitics, but we're not gonna beat it at its own game. We're going to beat it we're going to carve out a place for ourselves that works for us by leveraging more of what we do, the kinds of financial assistance that we do better. So that's one set of issues, and that's an area that we just didn't play at all over the last 4 years, by the way. So the Biden administration has, and that maybe before that we were a little slow to think strategically, and I think you point the finger at Congress here, really. So we have a lot of ground to catch up there. But then there's a whole other question, which is what kind of international economic system best suits our security needs, our domestic economic needs? What kind of international system best produces the kind of social cohesion that makes democracy possible? Because we unfortunately, going back to points that a couple of you made about how the US isn't the only country experiencing polarization, extremism, breakdown of domestic systems, it really looks like highly globalized developed world capitalism wasn't really good for social cohesion, wasn't really good for small d democracy. So that probably means that the trade infrastructure that we built to go with that is not the trade infrastructure that's going to best support democracy going forward. I am trying not to use the word free trade, because what we had before was not actually free trade. And, I'm sure, I don't know what University of Denver's requirements are, but we all took our 2 or 3 classes, and we tend to have this idea, if someone, the famous Tom Friedman quote, if it's a trade agreement, I know I like it. Well, that approach didn't serve us well. So I think the space where the Biden domestic agenda and the Biden international agenda can work well together, and where we can work well with our allies, if we're able to build the kind of really deep, trusting relationships that Leslie and Michael have been talking about, is to say, okay, we all have to be able to do well by our own citizenry in order to continue to have democratic governments and keep at bay the forces of populism that are not just present in the US. Sorry, as much fun as it is to point fingers at Trump. But that requires a lot of rethinking. It brings a lot of places where, frankly, as I said, the US and Europe, for instance, are each other's biggest competitors. We're familiar with some other areas where US popular sentiment is very neuralgic about some Asian competitors. So this is a long-term realignment. The import of what Biden is trying to do is a long-term realignment of both how we think about our relationship with our allies and how we do our domestic economic policy, keeping in mind the needs of our allies. And actually, just to sum up with something much less abstract and bring climate change into it, border carbon adjustments. So both President Biden on the campaign trail pledged to do border carbon adjustments, which are kind of tariffs for countries that are producing less green goods. That's my cheap explanation. The European Union similarly has committed to do one. Now, if we can't make them match, then we will be tariffing each other's goods, and that will be a huge problem. But the European Union has to consolidate all its members around a single policy, and the US, Biden has to come up with something that can get through Congress. So that is an almost, I mean, it's a no-brainer that the US and Europe should have matching border carbon adjustment policies, but it's just vanishingly difficult to imagine how that could happen. And I think you see that play out on economic issue after issue. So that's both the beauty of the goal is that you have a small d democratic economic space. And then the sort of hard, cold reality is how many different political factors you have to fight your way through to do it.
Well, can I ask one more question? And this was like spurred actually by Leslie's comment about CNN and what it's like to watch the US from abroad. But it connects to your last comment, Heather, too, which is, no matter what the Biden administration does, it's going to be how people know about it that's going to be the key to its success. And it's incredibly complicated now, with a particular kind of media landscape, even among the media, but then there's the whole kind of social media and other sort of information landscape. If you could give like one suggestion to this administration about sort of how to manage information and being able to sort of get information out, what would that be?
Who is that? Is that for Heather?
That's for all of you.
All of us. So it's for Michael.
Why don't you start, Leslie? We'll go in reverse alphabetical order.
Okay. Can I answer that and also add something to Heather's earlier comment?
Sure.
How to manage? Well, it is less of an issue. I think the bigger issue over here, so I'll be more interested to hear what all of you have to say. The bigger issue over here is how do you get a debate going about, what Biden's trying to do, so that we continue to have rigor around the question of U.S. foreign policy. I personally was, quite happy that Larry Summers published the piece that he did, but I could see how it was kind of deeply problematic because nobody wants to have the debate about moving quickly on fiscal stimulus because there are so many Americans suffering. And yet we do need to have debate and rigor that is not partisan. So I found that really complicated. And the international side, we need to kind of not, CNN is great and all these people over here watch BBC, CNN, and frankly, not a lot else because we don't get a lot else unless you sort of find it. But there does need to be more, there's going to have to be more rigor at some point, knowing that we're all part of, the project of resolving the big problems as opposed to breaking it down. But how do you introduce rigor that's not partisan is the big dilemma for me. I just wanted to add one thing to Heather's comments, which I thought were great. And I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I wonder if one way that the US, the US hasn't been doing infrastructure financing abroad and all the rest of it, but can it get back in the game by working on the, contributing positively to the conversation about debt refinancing in the global South? That is, obviously going to be big in a COVID and post-COVID environment. So that's one area where maybe the US can win some capital back, social capital, but also make a positive contribution. And then my second comment is, I think I'm one of the few people, I am, a registered Democrat, and I'm sympathetic. I'm sympathetic to all the arguments about. I'm an independent, scholar and analyst, but I'm a registered Democrat. I'm sympathetic to all the critiques of trade and everything else. But I'm really, really desperately upset that the U.S. is writing itself out of all the regional institutions in Asia. It really bothers me. Not in RCEP. Okay, it wasn't maybe going to be in RCEP. Not in the AIIB. Not in CPTPP, not. And I think that the cumulative effect of being outside of, even though there's a rational argument, certainly a strong domestic argument, the cumulative effect of not being in those different institutions is going to be very costly very soon. So that's my comment on the trade question.
All right, Michael, let's go to you. Do you have a media or trade comment?
Yeah, so I hope this answers your question, Debbie, but this will give me a chance as we're wrapping up to reiterate and drive home a point I've been trying to make earlier on North Korea specifically. I think one thing Biden can do, it's very hard for Democrats to do this, is to say something nice about the Trump legacy. I don't want to say Donald Trump. That would be a stretch for almost any partisan Democrat, or even for a less partisan one like myself. But Trump hired a lot of great people, whether by accident. He hired a lot of not so great people too. But people like Jim Mattis, Mark Esper, a lot of other people did some interesting things. And there were times where even Trump himself, maybe by good luck or disdain for previous protocol, actually disrupted in a way that may not have produced good results, but at least it opened up space for a new conversation. And I think Biden should say, listen, I got no problem with President Trump normalizing the idea of talking to Kim Jong-un. In fact, Barack Obama wanted to do that himself back when he challenged George W. Bush's use of the term of axis of evil and rogue state and wanted to reach out in his first inaugural, which I referenced earlier. Donald Trump sort of made it happen. Unfortunately, he lost the momentum, he squandered the opportunity, but he did something useful. That's just an example of where you can actually say something nice about, Republicans anyway, in general terms, or even say something slightly positive about the Trump legacy without supporting what Trump himself actually did on a policy where you probably have deep disagreement with the outcome. So that would be a suggestion, because then I think we start to have a more serious conversation about what worked and what didn't. And we're going to have to work hard to take the Trump out of things, especially with Trump potentially going to run for re-election. It's going to be hard to, take the toxicity out of that conversation. The way you do it, I think, is be more specific about policies and opportunities.
Great. Heather, you have the last word.
So I think to build a little bit on what you both have said, the thing I would suggest is don't give up on trying for monolithic media control and embrace the ability to use multiple outlets, multiple voices, multiple platforms. I understand that you shouldn't be over reliant on Twitter, which only nerds like me love and adore, but I have been very encouraged that the administration has encouraged folks going in to keep their Twitter accounts and use them. And you, Leslie, raise a really interesting point about the back and forth with Larry Summers, which again could have its own whole hour of conversation. But all the questions that we've talked about actually over this hour are so big and complicated and have so many interests and disagreements that you critically need more people and more segments of the population to feel like they're involved and committed and engaged in the conversation in a real way. So you need to use a lot more outlets and platforms than maybe we have been traditionally comfortable with in the national security space. And I think actually, ironically, if we were better at doing that in the past, that would have yielded up some other alternatives to stay involved in regional institutions in Asia. So with that, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Let me add our thanks to Michael, Leslie, and Heather for really a fascinating conversation. I really wish we could just keep talking. I wanted to remind everyone in our audience and the three of you as well that the Joseph Korbel School is hosting the Denver Democracy Summit in just a few weeks on the February 25th and 26th. And Debbie and I are joining forces again on a breakout group discussion. So we're looking forward to that. But thank you so much for a fabulous conversation today. Really pleased that you could all join us.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for hanging in there as we went over. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.